So thank you all for joining us for this month's A11y Talks. Each month we get together with some really fantastic people who discuss a variety of accessibility topics with us. So please be sure to follow us on Twitter. That's A11yTalks, A11yTalks, to keep apprised of what's coming up and as we maybe share other news and events and wonderful things like that. And also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can check out past talks, be aware of when future talks are released. And with that whole YouTube channel thing, please keep in mind we are being recorded right now. So if you have a sense of humor like mine, just tuck that back in. Really, just hold on to the end, but we definitely want to hear from you. So if you have questions or thoughts you'd like to share, please feel free to use the chat in the Zoom, or go ahead and tweet us and do that hashtag A11yTalks, and we'll make sure to address that at the end of this if there's time. So we are fortunate enough to have with us today two amazing women that come from us from the Access team at UC Berkeley to discuss how to test for accessibility with actual people. Imagine that. We have Caroline Boyden. She has recently spoken at Bad Camp about Accessibility 201. I was psyched to be in the audience and listening to that one. It was Tales from the Front End. And she'll be speaking upcoming DrupalCon in regards to Accessibility Deep Dive Workshop. So that should be fun and exciting as well. Heavily into board games and a fan of puzzle hunts, she is just this very dynamic speaker, and I'm excited to hear her go ahead. And she's partnering today with Lucy Greco, who frankly has had just too many talks to bother to mention them all. They're awesome. She's a leader of a group of blind professionals, the Blind Accessibility Testers Society. No, I wasn't reading that at all. And together, that team is working together to become better testers and help educate us as well. So beyond that, she's an incredible baker, and she roasts her own coffee, which means she already has a huge fan in me. So with that, I am going to turn off my video, turn off my mic, and hand it over to these wonderful women. And I can't wait to hear what we have, what we get to learn about today. Thank you for coming.
All right, great. Thanks, Donna. Thanks, Carrie, for having us on the talk today. So to go a little bit more into the introductions here, make sure that I can switch the slides. Yeah. So I'm a Drupal developer. This is Caroline. I'm a Drupal developer and an accessibility advocate at UC Berkeley, and I've been doing Drupal since 2010, accessibility since 2004, and web development for a really long time. And Lucy.
I'm Lucy Greco, and I have been an accessibility advocate, well, my entire life. I am totally blind, and I have been a professional at web accessibility since the mid-90s. So it's been a long path, and I want to bring more people along that road with me.
Cool. So before we get too much deeper into this, I have to give you all a disclaimer, which is that Lucy and I, we have opinions. We have a lot of opinions.
Very strong ones.
Very strong opinions. And the Regents of the University of California would like us to inform you that opinions expressed in this talk are just ours, and that nothing we say here should be taken as an endorsement of any product, service, or company. That is actually the law in the state of California. So you might hear us talk about things we like, but the University of California would like you to know that it doesn't necessarily like them just because we do. So the opening question is why? Why test for accessibility with real people? So, maybe isn't there like a robot that can do that for me? Or, maybe I should just, as a sighted person, just decide to dive in and learn a screen reader myself. So there are robots, but there are some limits to automation, the things you can do with automated testing.
Exactly. So the nice thing about the robots is it's a good starting place. It will catch a lot of low-hanging fruit, but in the end, ultimately, it can only test 15 to 20% of your site or your application, what have you. Automated robots, tools, you can go through, create your scripts and all the rest of that, cannot tell you what a person is going to encounter and how they're going to feel when they encounter it. So testing with real people is important because you, first of all, get to see how different people interact with your tool, but you can also get the emotional gut hit when it's difficult, or the emotional high when it actually works really well for an individual.
Right. So the 20% is like an automated tool can catch about 20% of the problems that you might have, but there are lots of things that require human judgment. Also, you might think, well, I can do something, learn an assistive technology, or do something to pretend that I'm the person with a disability if you don't have one yourself and you don't use an assistive technology. But there are also some limits to that kind of simulation of a disability.
So first of all, learning something like a screen reader, for example, there are over 2,000 commands. And you're a developer and you have very limited time in your role and you have deadlines, and learning those 2,000 commands is a lot of time and a lot of commitment that you might not necessarily have. And you may not necessarily know what that command actually means, how to use it in what situation. And it turns out that most people with disabilities all use those commands very differently than each other. They don't all work the same. They don't all work alike. And sometimes there's 3 to 4 commands that have to be used in different situations. And it's a lot of time and a lot of work. It's not worth your time to learn assistive technology.
Mm-hmm. And learning the technology isn't the same as experiencing the barrier. If you don't have a disability, if you don't use assistive technology, and you learn one and you use it to browse your site or whatever, you can cheat if you hit a barrier. You can plug your mouse back in and get past it, but someone who relies on the technology full time will not be able to cheat and get around it.
Back to our gut punch.
Yes. And also, if you, for example, are a sighted person using a screen reader, you will be able to see things on the screen that if the assistive technology can't see those, then a blind person will never know what they can't get to. And the same thing with the keyboard testing. If you can't tab to it with the keyboard, you'll never know that it's interactive.
It's very, very common for me to work with a developer and them say, this works perfectly. And then as soon as I come in and I can't get to something, like, I don't understand that. It doesn't make sense, because they've tested it themselves, but what they've tested it, their brain fills in the gaps that the assistive technology is providing.
Yep. So we talked a little bit about this, but command overload, their assistive technologies are complicated and powerful. And how many hours of training did you have on JAWS when you first started using it?
I train for every single version. I get several hours of updating, not with an individual, but teaching myself what the new commands are. I mean, hours and hours of training.
Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of different types of assistive technology. So you might be interested in learning a screen reader, which we actually don't recommend unless you actually need it. But there's also speech input. There are virtual keyboards. There are switches. There are magnifier programs. There are tons of different things that you might be able to learn, but you probably don't have time to learn all of them. And the last reason we say to test with real people is to get a fresh perspective on the things that you're building.
It's always really important to think about your tool in the way you want to make it work, but then you bring somebody in who has a disability and all of a sudden they're going at it from a completely different angle. You know, you're looking at the page and you see that body content immediately and it stands out. The assistive technology user might be going at that very linearly, and the first thing they hear is not what you think the first thing they should get is. So it's really important to get those fresh perspectives and fresh paths of travel.
And someone who uses an assistive technology can point out different ways of navigation, different ways to get quickly to the content they're interested in. For example, someone who uses a screen reader might say, hey, you know, it would really help if there were a heading there. It's a separate section of content and it would be easy to navigate to if there were a heading in that location.
Exactly.
So I hope we've convinced you about the why. of testing accessibility with real people. And I want to get a little deeper into something that you can do yourself, because you are yourself a real person. Even if you don't have a disability, you are still a real person. And so to set yourself up for success, there are some things you can do first. You don't want to waste your tester's time talking through things you could be figuring out yourself. So you don't need to wait for a blind person to tell you that there's no alt text on your images. A bot can tell you that. That's something that they're very good at. And you don't need to wait for someone who cannot use a mouse. You can do keyboard testing yourself. So if you start with a code review or a heuristic review or a review of the web accessibility guidelines of your source code, you'll start off at a great place for beginning your testing with real people. And in order to help you with that, we here at the Web Access team have created a checklist that's kind of like a one-stop shop, recommendations for things to do before you get any real people involved. So this is a Google Sheet. The link goes to a page that describes the Google Sheet, but it's basically a set of checklists that you can go through on your own as a developer, a designer, or a content creator, whatever your role is, and check out how your site is doing against these criteria. And pretty much everything we list on it is something that we have seen as a problem in the web accessibility clinics we do here at UC Berkeley.
And these are all things that a developer can test for themselves. This is not something that, we've discovered it in the accessibility clinics using a screen reader. This is something that would have been easy to find.
Yep. So that, for example, there's a tab on the checklist about things to look for when you test with a keyboard. I'm about to go into more detail on that. But also there's some code level gotchas, like things that people do to their code that actually make things less accessible rather than more. So you are a real person. You, the designer or developer, regardless of whether or not you have a disability or use an assistive technology, there are some very effective things you can do to test. And the first thing is to test with the keyboard. So if you don't have a disability that affects how you interact with technology, and you don't rely on assistive technology, testing with the keyboard is a great proxy for all different kinds of things. For example, if you think about speech input, you might not think that keyboard testing has anything to do with speech input because people are talking to their computer instead of typing. But Dragon, which is a big speech input software, actually emulates the keyboard. You can say press tab or press Alt F4, or you can create macros that basically string together a bunch of keyboard commands, and a lot of assistive technologies emulate the keyboard. So if you test with the keyboard, you'll be covering a lot of ground there.
This is really important too, because remember we said you don't want to waste your tester's time, and you also want to get the most out of testing with a person. If you haven't done keyboard testing and that testing with the real person stops very early on because you can't get past go, you can't do anything with that tester, you've now wasted your time, the tester's time, and created a lot of frustration and a lot of anxiety, because it just causes a lot of stress to not be able to do something. I have done testing where I've come in and the first thing I try and do is tab through the site, and I can't tab through. I get stuck, the tab focus doesn't move. We had one application where as I tabbed through the site, there were supposedly 10 or 12 controls on the page and a couple of links, and all I got was a cancel button. So, the hour and a half we had set aside to test this particular application stopped right there at the very first screen. Yeah.
And that sets people up for frustration, and nobody wants to test while they're cranky.
Exactly.
Right. So I'm going to go into a bit of detail about how to test with the keyboard. And if you were at Bad Camp in October, some of this was a part of the presentation I did there for Accessibility 201. The first thing is to unplug everything. If you have a mouse or a trackball, cover up your touchpad. If you have that little eraser thingy in the middle of the keyboard, then you can ignore that. You just need to be testing with the physical keyboard. And it's not just the tab key. Complicated interfaces will also take advantage of the arrow keys, modifier keys, page up, page down, home and end, but basically things you can do with the keyboard. And specific things to look for, again, some of this is in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and all of it is something that we've seen a problem with at some point in one of our clinics. And often we see these same problems over and over and over again. So skip repeated content, this is pretty basic. If you have a skip link, that's a great way to just knock this one out right away. Make sure that people can skip over repeated content and get to the main content of the page.
There's very few sites now that don't have these, but there are still a lot of them that when you test it, it actually doesn't go anywhere.
Right, it doesn't work.
Or the wrong place.
Or the wrong place, yeah. Tab in both directions. So if you're using JavaScript or whatever and you're intercepting keystrokes, we've seen some applications where you could tab forward just fine. But if you tried to tab backwards using Shift Tab, you would get stuck, which is a keyboard trap. And you never want to put your user into a keyboard trap. So make sure you can tab all the way through your interface in both directions.
Well, and I've also just recently tested a competitive product to Drupal that tabbing backwards brought you to different places than tabbing forwards. And you know, you think you'd miss something and you go backwards and you could never find the thing you just tapped over.
Which is crazy making. So
absolutely crazy making.
Yeah. Fully operable. Everything that's interactive on your page has to be usable with the keyboard. So if you have an expand and collapse, a tree view, a slider, a modal or a lightbox or an overlay, even a drag and drop, you have to be able to perform the action with the keyboard only. And if you are using overlays or modals, you have to be able to dismiss them with just the keyboard, because if you can't, then that automatically creates a keyboard trap.
Well, and you have to make sure too that the person isn't tabbing behind them.
Yes. Lovely, lovely segue there.
Yes.
When you are using a modal, your focus should be constrained within it. Otherwise, someone who's using the tab key will tab off it and be interacting with the page behind the modal and unable to see where they are, and that can also create a keyboard trap right there. Focus needs to be visible. So browsers have built-in focus highlighting, but it's often inadequate. So you need to create your own focus styles that work with the foreground and background colors that you're using for your interface. And also, this is a great way to verify that there isn't content that's visibly hidden, but still interactable. Because if you're using something that shows and hides content, you don't want people to be tabbing through content that they can't see. Or if you've gone to the trouble to collapse something, it's no help to someone who's using a screen reader if that is still available for them to interact with, even if it's not visible on the page.
Very, very difficult to communicate with people when they're seeing something that you're not.
Yes. So plug your mouse back in for a second and hover over the various parts of your interface and make sure there's an equivalent focus effect for all of your hover effects. Because if there isn't, then there will be an interactive component that your keyboard users will never know is interactive if it doesn't highlight for them.
Or it doesn't give them the tooltip about what you're supposed to do at that point.
Right. And finally, after you've done all this stuff, you should be increasing your browser zoom until you hit your first responsive breakpoint, and then try it all again. And then zoom in again until you hit the next breakpoint. Because if someone's using browser zoom because they have low vision, or if they're using screen magnifier software, they are likely to be interacting with what you think of as your tablet or your phone version, but they will be using a device with a keyboard instead of a touchscreen. So mobile breakpoints are not just for touchscreen users.
The other thing that's really important too is you want to avoid people from being able or having to horizontally scroll back and forth. When the site is increasing in its zoom, does it actually allow the person to still keep everything in the borders of the right and left?
Mm-hmm.
Horizontally scrolling for low vision users is painful, and it tends to cause them to get lost. think about moving back and forth across a line to follow that line of text, going back to the far left edge, you may jump up a line or down a line and not know where you are anymore. So make sure that as it's going through that, doing those breakpoints, that everything is still fitting within a relatively reasonable framework of left and right margins.
So now we get to testing with real people who are not you, so extra people.
More people.
More
Always
people.
good to have more people.
Yep. So we call this really testing with real people with real disabilities, which we recommend. So first, we think of this kind of testing from two different angles. One is usability testing, where your testers are people with disabilities. And the other angle is accessibility testing. And we consider those as two different approaches that are both valuable, and you should really do both if you can. So if you are doing accessibility testing as opposed to user testing with people with disabilities, you can expect that your accessibility tester is going to have a lot of expertise in the subject, not only on their own setup, but on accessibility in general.
Exactly. They're going to know, what the violation is. If it's a violation of the W3C, they're going to be able to explain best practices to you. They're going to be able to, tell you, yeah, this was actually usable, but actually, technically, there's a couple of compliance problems, different things like that.
Yeah. And another difference is how flexible you might need to be in how the test setup is going to run. So if you have done like standard usability testing, you know that you don't necessarily jump in and tell people how to get past the problem they're encountering. That's not something you usually do in standard accessibility testing. And you wouldn't necessarily do that, standard usability testing. But if you're doing accessibility testing, you might need to be more flexible.
Exactly. You want the person with the disability to get moving through the process. You want them to know, first of all, that it's not them, it might be the actual application, and you need to have them move on and get some success out of the process.
Yeah. Whereas in a standard usability test, with or without having your tester being a person with a disability, you probably would not jump in and would not provide any guidance.
Exactly.
And what was that? Was that test you did with a cell phone company?
So a couple of months back, I was hired to do a testing for a cell phone manufacturer that had a overlay on the screen. And when you swiped into the overlay, you stayed in the overlay and you just couldn't get out of the overlay. And the task was to log in, but the overlay was giving you advertising about one of the new features that they had coming up. And there was no way to get out of that overlay. There was just none whatsoever. And sadly, the usability testers, or the people who were running that test, knew that the only way to get out of it was touch a different part of the screen, but they waited far too long to give it to me. And I basically got a real hate on for the vendor I was testing for. It was, there's a lot of emotion when you fail. As a person with a disability, when we use the internet, we get frustrated all the time. When you're putting me through this for testing, I don't care how much you're paying me, if you can't tell me how to get out of it, I'm not gonna like your product.
Right. So that's the question of are you gonna allow a task to fail if you're doing accessibility testing? If that task is a blocker for other tasks, you're gonna have to not let it fail and jump in and let your accessibility tester continue on with the tasks.
Exactly.
So ideally, you can do both usability testing with people with disabilities and accessibility testing. And when we launch into this next part of the talk, we're talking mostly about accessibility testing. We're talking about that angle. So before we get into it, if you're a regular at these accessibility talks, you may have seen a presentation last November by Liz Davis titled Practical Ways to Include People with Disabilities. And in that talk, she talked about how to recruit people, where to find them. She gave some history of disability movements and talked a lot about how to set up and conduct usability testing with people with disabilities. So I highly recommend that you go back and watch that if you weren't present for that. Now, some of what we're about to say covers a bit of the same ground, but as I said, we're coming at it from a slightly different angle. So I recommend that you take a look at that previous presentation. Start early in the process of development, doing your testing.
You don't want to be testing something that you're about to go live on tomorrow or you went live on last week. That does nobody any good.
Right. Stuff to do before you begin testing. Well, we covered a lot of that in the previous section. So to set yourself up for success, refer back to the previous section, all the different things that you can do in advance, the code review, the keyboard testing, etc., to make sure that you're starting from a great place. Goals and tasks.
So come up with the main purpose of what the tool you're testing needs to do, and come up with a specific number of things that a person should be doing. This is standard usability. You always have tasks and challenges for a person in usability, but it's really important to have those because it guides the entire conversation. It gets the person through. No one except for a full accessibility auditor is going to go through every single link on your website, every single control, make sure the color on every single page is right. You can't do that in an accessibility or usability test. Well, you could, but it could take you hours and hours and hours, depending on how many pages and links and so forth there are to test.
Right.
So come up with specific tasks. And when we do our clinics here, we, on average, for the 90-minute clinic, can get about 3 to 4 tasks done at most.
Yep. So if you are doing usability testing of any kind, or if you did keyboard testing, then using the same set of tasks is very helpful, because then you can benchmark. You can compare timing and flow between your standard usability testing or your keyboard testing, and also then your accessibility testing.
Or the difference between, say, a person using speech input and a person using a screen reader, or the person who might be using switches. You might, notice that, hey, the switch person can fly through my site, and the keyboard only user can fly through my site, but a person using Dragon gets completely stymied.
Yep. And so about timing, if you're using the same tasks as you use for standard usability testing, you might find that you don't have as much time to get through them all when your tester is a person who uses assistive technology.
Exactly.
So the timing, we've found maybe 2 to 3 times as long.
On average, it can be 2 to 3 times as long. If your coding is good and works well, it shouldn't take more than twice as long.
Right.
And sometimes it can go as fast, and sometimes it can actually go faster. But don't count on that.
Yeah. And also to keep in mind when you're comparing it to usability testing with people who don't have disabilities or don't use assistive technology, if it's going to take longer, you don't want to wear out your testers. Don't put them through a marathon trying to get through all 5 of your tasks when they only have time for 2.
It's really, really hard on a person to test. It's exhausting. It's fatiguing. Every time they encounter a failure, it's even more fatiguing. I once did a 9-hour marathon for one of our vendors here on campus, and it took me 2 weeks to recuperate from that. And
we found, when we do accessibility clinics, which is 90 minutes, it's pretty draining. It's very intense, and we're all really focused. And there was one day when we did 2 clinics in one day, and man, that was way too much. We were all drained and punchy by the end.
And you don't get the best results. I mean, you're going to get the best results within that first hour to hour and a half time frame. Give the person a break. Make the person, they are human beings, and there are human beings that will actually fatigue very quickly.
Yep. Because
these are very mentally challenging tasks that have that extra drain and extra frustration of inaccessibility. Literally it can wear the body out very, very quickly.
Yep. So when you're thinking about recruitment and setup, a lot of this was covered in, as I mentioned, in the accessibility talk that happened last November. Just to go over a little bit more about it, about how to recruit and where to find people to do your testing.
So you're all in a community, and in your community there are people with disabilities. You may not know them, but they are there. And it's good to look throughout your community. Look for service organizations such as, the National Organization for People with Cerebral Palsy, or the Lighthouse, or for people who are blind and visually impaired. If you're in Canada, CNIB. Go to these organizations and use them as recruiting tools. If you're near a college or a university, go to their disabled students program. Look for people in those types of organizations.
And online as well.
And online, yes, there are several different communities. The WebAIM community is a great place to recruit for users. You can email the BATS list. I might block you, but I will pass the message on. There are people there who are always looking for contracting work and consulting work to test.
All right. And go for variety if you have the time and the resources to test with people with different disabilities, because you will get different information from them.
Exactly. Don't always get an expert too. So for example, if you were to have me test for you, you're going to get a completely different experience than testing with a person who is not an assistive technology specialist like myself, who just uses a screen reader to get their job done every day. But it's also really important to get somebody who uses Dragon, somebody who is keyboard dependent, somebody who is switch dependent. I was once brought in to do a usability test on switches, and the one thing that taught me is I know nothing about switches. Although I learned a lot. I learned a lot and got a lot of empathy, and I appreciated the opportunity to go in and learn that. But it's really important to get somebody who knows what they're doing with that technology. They're the expert. They can help you understand what their experience is.
And because you are looking for experts, then you should be paying them. Don't expect people with disabilities or really anyone to work for free.
Yeah, there is a huge, huge push in our community to refuse people whenever you come to us and say, can you test something for me? And you don't do it for free. People are becoming very resentful. This is a historically underemployed and underpaid portion of our society. And this is a contribution they can make, and it's a valuable contribution, and you should be compensating them for that contribution. They are experts. You're not going to have somebody come paint your house who is a professional painter and ask him to do it for free. Why would you have them check your website to see how well it works with their assistive technology and not pay them?
So also when you're setting up, you need to ask about accommodations up front. And not just, you should really be doing this not just when you know you're recruiting someone with a disability. Ask everyone what accommodations they might need, ask early, ask often, and make sure that's another way to make sure that you're setting your testing up for success.
Exactly. The person might not identify as having a disability, but maybe it's a person who gets migraines and would prefer to work in a dark room. Maybe it's a person who, has narcolepsy. Maybe you need to be sure to have coffee on hand for them. Those kinds of things. Those are all accommodations that should be, considered. Don't start listing off accommodations, but just make sure that you know what will make that person comfortable while they're there with you. Other things to think about is your location. Or am I jumping ahead?
That was just the perfect transition.
Okay.
I hit the slide advance. I was like, I knew what you were going to say. It's like we've been working together for 15 years, Lucy.
Yes. So,
all right.
So think about your location. If you are in an office building that has no elevator and you're on the 4th floor, maybe you should be booking another location for that testing. If you are in a place where a person has to come find your office, the building is actually very, very accessible, but it's a maze to get back to your office, maybe you should think about having somebody there at the front door to meet them and actually walk them through and show them their way through. Make sure all your hallways are wide enough, the doorways can be traversed. You know, there's a standard that says 36-inch doorways. Well, sometimes a chair might be too large to even get through a 36-inch doorway. Find out what the person needs, but also be prepared for them not telling you. Be prepared for, how do I actually deal with this? What do we do? You know, set up your room space in a way that is very accessible. I have done some usability testing where they've had me walk in the room and the first thing they do is say, stop. And it's because they've set up their room space in a really inappropriate way. So the camera's right there, the tripod, the cables are all across the floor. Not acceptable. You can't do that to a person with a disability. It already sets them off balance and starts that irritation beginning. Make it so there's a nice, clear path of travel, that it's wide open for a person in a chair to get to, or
no trip hazards.
No trip hazards. You don't want to be wiping blood off of the hands or face of the person that you're testing with before you begin.
And also, let's talk about getting to the place. Transportation, public transit, paratransit.
Absolutely. So, again, this is a group of people who are, very, very low. You tend to have low incomes. Many of the people you might be working with, if you're going through these social service agencies, are on fixed income benefits. They can't afford to get to your location, even though your location might just be in a very centralized downtown area. We look here, and Uber, for me to get to anywhere in Silicon Valley, will cost about $50 or $60. So find a location that's near them, first of all, but then also pay for the transportation if you can. Consider that a cost of doing business. Consider it, you've got to get your tester there. Find out if you can book a transportation. There's paratransit services that can pick up people who use chairs. If it is a blind person, they might just be able to use Uber. So give them a means of getting reimbursed for that Uber trip. Or, pay for a taxi. Whatever your means is, you've got to get them there. Consider that part of the price, but don't make it sound like it's part of the compensation to the person. So I had one company tell me, we're going to pay you $100 for this usability test. And when I got there, they said, but it costs us $40, so you're only getting $60. I'm like, I'm out of here.
So BYOAT, bringing your own assistive technology. So you might have a lab set up, but people who use assistive technology should be able to bring and use their own devices. So you have to be prepared for that.
So the strongest case for this is, for example, somebody using Dragon. As you use Dragon, naturally speaking, it takes a little bit of time to set up a voice profile. And that voice profile gets better and better as you use it. And it's a massively large file that doesn't transfer well from computer to computer. You would think it does, but it does not, because it's...
And if you have an individual license, I don't think you can.
Well, you can move the file, but it's still based on the actual sound card in the machine. It's based on the microphone the person's using. It's just not... It's not a thing you want to play with. It would waste 3/4 of your testing time.
Yep.
So if the person brings their own machine, that machine's already ready to go. They've got their voice profile trained. You're set up. Screen readers. There's no way for you to know how a person has their screen reader set up. Do they have it set up to speak characters as they type? Do they have it set up to speak words as they type? Which speech synthesizer do they like best? Having them come in with their own environment, be able to use their own browser. And that's actually really important. Don't force somebody to use the browser you think works best. Have them use the browser that they know and they're comfortable with. I called a disability support desk for a major corporation a couple of months back and said, I'm having problems with this particular site of yours and I can't get it to work. And they said, well, that works great in Chrome with Chromevox. And I said, you've got to be kidding me, because I don't use Chromevox on Windows. Just stop.
Right. So being prepared for a variety of devices that people might bring in, making sure they can get on your network, making sure that whatever you're testing can be used on somebody else's device.
Exactly. Have an account for them. Have the ability for them to go there. I can't tell you how many times we've started a clinic and they'll say, just log in, and we get there and they go, so we didn't enable you. You don't have an account on this thing. And it's like, we've just wasted everybody's time.
Yep. So let's also talk about remote testing. We talked a lot about physical space setup, but you might want to do remote testing.
And remote testing actually is really effective. You're going to get an audience that may not be able to travel. Remember, we just said that an Uber might cost $50 to get to Silicon Valley. So why not do something like use a remote video screen sharing application? You can record, everything happens, communication. Remote testing is really, really effective. However, you have to be sure that the tools you're using for that remote testing are accessible themselves. Don't use WebEx. WebEx does not work very well with assistive technologies. It's very complex. It's very, when you start getting the screen reader into that mix or drag it into that mix, there's some microphone sharing issues. It's just don't use it.
So with the caveat that the University of California feels very strongly that we neither recommend nor disrecommend anything, Lucy, what do you use?
I use Zoom or Google Meet are the two I use. Depending on if I need to record, I will use Zoom. There's a lot of stuff I can do with it that's actually much more accessible. Google Meet, if you don't need to record, Google Meet works just fine as well. Also, both of those share the audio from the screen reader really well. Some other tools, you as the end user at the other end of the remote session may not actually hear what the screen reader is doing, and that's really critical and really important.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So that was mostly about setup. So during your tests, we have a couple of tips to get the most out of your testing. So when we talked about the difference between accessibility testing versus usability testing with people with disabilities, some of these suggestions might be different from what you're used to if you're thinking mainly in a usability testing framework. So the first one is knowing when to jump in to give some prompting or extra information.
So if you've done all the steps we've already talked about, getting ready and prepping for your tests and check the browser that the person is using, you may know where the person is going to hit a barrier. And it's really good to get the person to do as much as they can. And when they hit that barrier, don't make them struggle. Don't make them fight. Like that cell phone company, they knew that I had to touch the top of the screen to get out of that stupid trap. And they literally made me go through that for 10 minutes before they told me that trick. Don't do that. Don't do that at all. That's just making the situation worse. The person has encountered it. They have said there's a problem. Jump in and make sure the person realizes it's not their fault. Make sure you're doing it great. This is obviously a bug. We'll file it. Move on.
Yeah.
Get the person to the next step. Stepping in the case of usability and accessibility and usability testing can mean that you actually click the right thing that the person needs to click. So if you're doing that remote testing, that's another good reason for Zoom, because you can at least get control of their computer.
Mm-hmm. And we talked a little bit before about benchmarking. And so if you are running the same tests across many different people, you're going to be able to do some comparison. The person who you're testing with the assistive technology is probably going to have some insight into where the differences might be in timing.
Exactly. Never say to them, why did it take you so long? It's, how did you feel did that take you an appropriate amount of time? Was it, get them to rank and scale it for you. But then ask, should it have taken you that long? What do you think? Because maybe the person is actually slow, that maybe they're very meticulous and very, always cautious with their screen reader, making sure they're hearing everything. Maybe they think that was good and it worked enough for them. Never say, oh, Mary Jane took 10 minutes to do this. You took 30 minutes. Why? Always ask them how they felt it was. Could it improve? Was it good? Was it bad? But ask them also, do you think we could have made this go faster? Is there something we could have done to make this work better for you? Mm-hmm. And believe me, you will not get a person with a disability that answers that no.
More on the asking what your testers think. because they are, everyone who uses an assistive technology, we're all experts on our own lives.
Exactly.
And on our own technologies.
So a question I always like people asking me when I go in for a usability study is, tell me what you think you just did. Tell me what you think this process was supposed to accomplish and did it. Asking them what they think will get you a lot of insight. If somebody sits there, I remember going through a study once and I was like, well, this is a process to transfer money from one account to another. And it's like, actually, no, this process was actually supposed to help you understand which of your account balances were lower. So completely wrong. I got the wrong impression because ultimately where I ended up and where I was traveling was the wrong way to find out what I needed to do.
Mm-hmm. So we have tried to emphasize here that people who use assistive technology, people who have disabilities, anyone who's testing your site, we're all experts on our own situation. And you can get a lot of great insight and information from doing accessibility testing with real people. And that is what we have here for our presentation. I hope you all found it useful or informative or something.
Or at least entertaining.
Yeah, you guys were awesome. Thank you so much. We do have a handful of questions if you're ready for them.
Sure. Let's go for it. Are you going to interpret the chat then, or should we open it up?
Yeah, we have a couple of different sources they're coming from, so I'm just going to give all of them to you. The first was, you mentioned something with the testing about coming up with specific tasks. Now, I know in a lot of user testing scenario, they use scenario-based testing. Do you use that as well, or do you find that doesn't allow for the
No, absolutely. I mean, scenario-based tasks are very important. You need to book a flight to go to if you're on an airline site. That's very, very, those are very important tasks. But sometimes the task can be find the company name. So keep it simple, but also keep it, use a combination of all of these.
Wonderful. Another question was, what disabilities should you be testing for, or what disabilities should you target for your testing, I think is what the spirit of that question is.
So I would say you should try and find somebody who is a keyboard-only user. You should try and find somebody who has some form of motor impairment, who's using either switches or an alternative input device, maybe a head pointer, eye gaze, something like that. You should try and find a person who is a speech command and control person. You notice I did not say speech input, I said command and control. You should try and use a screen reader user, and preferably more than one, because all of us use our screen readers very differently. Caroline can tell you that whenever I test and I look at a page that's got labeled graphics, I hate them, but some blind people love them. So
yeah, Lucy hates verbosity.
Yeah, I hate verbosity. I want to get through something fast, and other blind people want to know about every single thing that's there on the page. So that's a really important one. You should get people who are deaf or hard of hearing. That's really critical and really important.
And one thing so that's a lot.
Oh, and low vision.
Yeah, low vision. So that's a lot. So I guess we haven't really narrowed it down that much. And so going back to something we said earlier, in my opinion, because so many assistive technologies emulate the keyboard, that getting someone who is keyboard only or keyboard primary is going to be a great help.
Yes.
So if you can do one thing, I think that is the one thing you would do. And something we haven't covered, but is also a real thing that you have to consider, is people who process information differently. There are tons of experiences people might have that, they process information differently. Maybe they have ADHD, or they're on the autism spectrum, or they have, they have depression or anxiety, which can affect how you process information.
Or could even be stimulated by color.
Yep.
You've got a perfectly good high contrast color that works beautifully. Maybe that person with dyslexia finds that the letters in your contrast vibrate for them.
Yeah, so occasionally you can run into some kind of dueling disabilities issues where high contrast is good for someone but bad for someone else.
Yes, but you can usually, adjust for both of those with a lot of work.
Mm-hmm. I hope we've answered that question.
I think you have. That's awesome. Thank you. The next on our list was actually a follow-up to that one was you mentioned or clarified the difference between speech input and versus speech command and control. Can you give us just the quick 411 on that difference?
So some people might just dictate text. Say, for example, a person who is dyslexic and doesn't want to type and make mistakes, they may just dictate text. Command and control is somebody that actually uses their speech input to say things like click the link, X, or tab. Somebody who does say tab. Open the menu. Open file menu. Open edit menu. That's command and control. Select 3 words to highlight something. Cut, copy, paste are commands that they give.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Thank you. What do you consider to be basically a good user pool or the number of people that would be an effective number to bring into a testing scenario?
If you had the ideal perfect pool,
Mm-hmm.
I would say maybe 3 to 4 with each different disability.
That's a lot.
I said ideal perfect magical world.
Yeah.
As many as you can get. If you end up only getting 2 people, that's better than doing none.
All right. And we had a question basically asking additional ways to maybe recruit people. And I did put the link to our November's talk that you referenced in the chat. However, can you just touch on a couple of those again? I remembered hearing you say Lighthouse, but if you had just a moment to give us a quick bulleted list, because we have a couple more questions after this.
Yeah, so the first thing to do is do in your local agency, Google, if you live in Seattle, do, Seattle Blind.
Or Center for Independent Living.
Or something like that. Just look up terms that people with disabilities would use, find out what the service organizations are, go find them. There are a couple of new companies now that are actually trying to market the whole idea of usability testing. I would actually avoid those personally, because they tend to get you to people who are too expert and not actual real users.
Okay.
That's very insightful. Thank you. And in regards to the average cost, when they're planning a project, do you have any guidelines or ballpark range that you'd suggest either on a per project or an hourly basis that our people here can start planning ahead?
So the average price that's being paid here in the Bay Area is very different than what would be paid somewhere else in the country. We are a very high priced area. Most projects that I'm seeing that are recruiting outside of the Bay Area are paying anywhere from $60 to $100 for an hour to 90-minute testing cycle. In the Bay Area here, it's $150, $200 for an hour to 90-minute cycle.
And are those costs different when you have an in-person versus remote testing scenario?
It should never be different, no. A lot of the remote testing scenarios do pay like $30 to $50 an hour. Note that I won't take those. If I'm any indicator.
All right. Wonderful. Now, I think does anyone in the chat have any additional questions? I'm doing one last check on Twitter to make sure we don't have anybody I missed. All right. I think that's all for our questions. Do you have any closing thoughts you'd like to share with us today?
The last thing that we did not cover that I'd really like people to think about is, if at all possible, get people with disabilities working on your development teams. Then they're built in. They're there in your process, and they can help you from the beginning, from design to implementation.
Absolutely. Accessibility really needs to be ingrained into the process at every stage,
Yes.
and including in our team. So thank you very much. Thank you, Caroline and Lucy, for joining us today. Thank you for everyone for attending this month's A11y Talks. We'll be posting this onto YouTube channel. There's the link in the chat, and we'll be posting that on Twitter once it is up there. Give us a day or two to get this prepped and ready to roll. And after that, you'll keep an eye on our Twitter account for what comes up next month. But just sincere thank you to Caroline and Lucy for joining us and sharing this today. It's been very insightful.
All right. Thank you very much for having us. And I will also post a link to the slides on the Drupal.org event page, if that's going to be helpful.
That would be wonderful. There's actually 2 links in your slides that I missed when we were going through them. So I know that one of our attendees here was asking for those. So that would be fantastic.
Great. Thank you. Thanks again. It was fun.
All right. See everyone next month. Have a great day.